this video, we'll be doing an overview of respiration. This is actually quite an important one because a lot of application question always links back to the concept of respiration. So in this video, we will try to summarize the key information together. So what is respiration? What are the two types of respiration? What would like when we're exercising, when we need more energy, how does our body change in response to that? And also a little bit about the liver. So we're going to try to link everything together to make it coherent. So we're going to go through it step by step. So first of all, what is respiration and what are the two types? To start with, a very important thing to remember is that respiration is not breathing. Okay, respiration is not breathing. Breathing is a mechanical process of bringing air into and out of our lungs. It is us physically changing our chest volume and hence chest pressure to allow air to flow in and out of our lungs. That is breathing. Respiration, however, it's a chemical reaction that breaks glucose down to release energy. Okay, it is a chemical reaction to break glucose down in order to release energy. So on that note, it's important to remember that respiration is an exothermic reaction. Right, it releases heat in the process, and that is why when we're exercising, we start to feel warmer and we start to sweat. It's because our body is doing more respiration, which is meaning that it releases more heat than usual. So it's an exothermic chemical reaction that breaks glucose down for energy. So, and this is the second really important point, is that respiration releases energy. We say energy is released, it's provided, but it is never produced, made, or created. Okay, so you can only say releases or provide energy, but you cannot say create energy, you cannot say make energy, you cannot say create energy. So any of those would actually deduct marks from your answer. So it's a very, very important point to remember. Respiration releases energy. So why is it important that we have energy though? So there are quite a few different uses of energy. We're going to explore a few of them. First of all, energy is used in muscle contractions, which is essentially what happens during any types of movement. So later on we'll talk about exercise, so we'll talk a bit more about muscle contractions at that point. But the key thing is that energy is used in muscle contractions for movement. Secondly, it is used to for maintaining our body temperature. For the human body, it's maintained at around 36 to 37 degrees Celsius, and that is actually relying on the constant occurrence of respiration. So any cell that isn't respiring is essentially a dead cell. So that is one of the hallmarks of being a living cell, is that it's able to release energy through respiration, and a lot of that heat energy that's released through this exothermic reaction is used to maintain our body temperature. It is also used in building larger molecules. Now, this is a sort of seemingly roundabout way to say growth and repair, but the reason why we have to say building larger molecules is because growth and repair can be quite general. Like, it does require energy, but it also requires lots of other things. So when it comes to a question that asks you about the importance of respiration in growth, then the idea is that respiration gives energy in order for those chemical reactions to happen, to build things together. For example, energy is needed to put two amino acids together to make a protein. Last but not least is that energy is also needed for active transport. So some of you may remember in earlier chapters when you looked at the different types of transport mechanism in living things. You got diffusion and osmosis and also active transport, which requires energy to move chemicals against its concentration gradient. So these are the four uses of energy from respiration. We'll come back to muscle contraction later on. So now let's have a look at the two types of respiration. So we got the two types. We got aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So aerobic, think of aero. If you ever had the chocolate Aero, it's a chocolate that is made with lots and lots of air bubbles inside. So essentially, aerobic respiration happens with oxygen. So it's happening in the presence of oxygen, whereas anaerobic, an usually means without. So anaerobic respiration happens without oxygen. So a few key things to remember is that they both release energy, and they're both breaking glucose down. But in the case of aerobic respiration, it's a complete breakdown. So it's a complete breakdown of glucose. So that means all of the atoms are completely rearranged to become something else. And aerobic respiration also releases a lot more energy. Essentially, all living things rely on the occurrence of aerobic respiration, because anaerobic releases so little energy that it's only used in the case of when you need that extra bit of energy to keep you going. It's almost like a survival mechanism, but you need to do aerobic respiration to have all of the energy that you need to support survival. So in comparison, anaerobic, it's a partial breakdown of the glucose. So that means that the glucose molecule is not completely broken down into smaller molecules. It's broken down into like an intermediate molecule, and also it releases little energy. So we'll look at some specific examples of different the two ways that anaerobic respiration will occur. But for now, let's focus on aerobic respiration first. So here's the word equation for aerobic respiration. It is where glucose plus oxygen react together to make carbon dioxide and water. Sometimes in exams it might be a 1 or 2 mark question where they ask you to complete the word equation. However, if you're doing separate sciences, then you will also need to know these balanced simple equation. Now, regardless of if you're doing separate or combined, you need to know the chemical formula for glucose, which is C6H12O6. C6H12O6. And reacts with 6 O2 to make 6 CO2 and 6 H2O. So that is the balanced simple equation. C6H12O6, which is the chemical formula for glucose, reacting with 6 O2 oxygen, making 6 CO2 carbon dioxide and 6 H2O. So that's the equation for aerobic respiration. So see how this is what we mean by a complete breakdown. So all of the atoms in the glucose gets broken down into smaller molecules like carbon dioxide and water. So in animals, for example, the glucose would come from food or energy storage as well. So same for plants as well. So that will come from that. Oxygen would come from the atmosphere. Animals breathe in oxygen from the atmosphere. And then we breathe out carbon dioxide, and we might breathe some of the water molecules out, but also keep some of it as well. For plants, remember that plants, all living things do aerobic respiration, including plants. So they could also use energy store like starch as well. However, keep in mind that photosynthesis also takes place in plants because they can absorb light. And photosynthesis is actually the exact opposite of aerobic respiration. Plants can use up carbon dioxide and water to make glucose and oxygen. So therefore, plants are able to just make use of their own products to do aerobic respiration. Now, on the other hand, we also have anaerobic respiration. As I mentioned, it's where the glucose is partially broken down without the oxygen. Now, this reaction will happen differently in animals compared to in plants and yeast and fungi. So we're going to look at these two equations now. The one on top, where the glucose is broken down without oxygen, then it breaks down partially into ethanol, but also releases carbon dioxide. This is a reaction that happens in plants and yeast. So that is kind of the reason why that we actually do, this process is actually called fermentation. So humans use this reaction for our own benefit. So we use it in fermenting for alcohol. So a lot of the wine or beer or alcoholic drinks is made using anaerobic respiration of yeast, for example. And the other thing, and plants as well, that's where the glucose comes from, is from grapes, for example, which is or from the malt plants, and that's how they can make all of these different alcoholic drinks. Alternatively as well, we also use yeast in baking. Let's say you're making bread and the bread dough rises when you allow it to proof, and that is because that is the process of fermentation, where the yeast can actually break the glucose down partially to release carbon dioxide, causing the bread dough to rise. However, in the case of this reaction in animals, it's not as good. So in animals, glucose gets turned into lactic acid. So as I mentioned earlier, anaerobic respiration is a situation where you don't have oxygen, but you still need energy, so you kind of start tapping into doing this reaction. So the glucose is broken down partially into lactic acid, which is not ideal. And that is the case of where it kind of starts causing muscle fatigue, for example. So muscle fatigue is the scientific term to say how the muscles get tired and they won't be able to contract properly. So how do animals try their best to avoid doing anaerobic respiration? So we're going to now go back to what we mentioned earlier in terms of muscle contractions. So we mentioned earlier that respiration releases energy, which allows us to do muscle contractions for movement. So in the case of when you're resting, like you're sitting still, or when you're just walking about, you would the amount of respiration happening would be enough to release certain amounts of energy for you to do your regular day-to-day movements. However, when you're exercising, you would require more energy because you're contracting more muscles, which means you need more energy, which means that aerobic respiration needs to be happening faster. So in aerobic respiration, it requires oxygen and glucose. So how do we make sure we have more oxygen and glucose being delivered to our muscles for more aerobic respiration to occur? So a few things happen. First of all, your heart rate increases. This is to increase the delivery of oxygen and glucose around the body. On top of that, your breathing rate also increases, which is the concept of trying to breathe in more oxygen as much as you possibly can and to also remove as much CO2 as you can. Any glycogen stored in your body would be converted into glucose. And again, it's about trying to supply more glucose, which is the reactant for aerobic respiration. All of these changes that we see is to do two things. Number one, it is to increase the oxygen and glucose delivery to muscles. If there are more glucose and oxygen in the muscles, that means more aerobic respiration can occur, more energy can be released. On top of that, you're also increasing the rate at which carbon dioxide is removed. Because you're breathing quicker or you're breathing more heavily, you are allowing more CO2 to be breathed out as well. Now let's look at the big picture here. So the key thing to remember is that when we are exercising, we would do all of those changes. And the point is to increase oxygen and glucose delivery to the muscles so that more aerobic respiration can continue to occur. This is the point about making sure that there's an enough supply of oxygen. So if there is enough oxygen, then you can continuously do more aerobic respiration for more energy, for more muscle contractions. Let's say you're already breathing much harder and your heart rate is much higher, but you're using up the oxygen quicker than you can supply it. Right? This is what it means by if there is not enough oxygen. Without any choice, your body will have to start doing anaerobic respiration in order to supply the energy for those muscle contractions that you kind of forcing yourself to do. So that is the case of glucose being broken down into lactic acid. So like I said, it causes muscle fatigue, which is not great because obviously it kind of damages some of your proteins and it will hurt afterwards, but it does give you that extra energy that you need in order to keep going with whatever exercise that you're doing. But the thing is, as you might remember, you have in the past done exercise and you feel a lot of pain the second day around, but that pain doesn't stay there forever. That pain will go away. So what is happening? What's happening to the lactic acid that we have produced during anaerobic respiration? So the key thing is that lactic acid will be transported through the blood away from the muscles and go to another organ that is responsible for breaking it down. And that organ is the liver. Now, the liver is a very important organ. It's the second largest organ in the body, apart from the skin, and it does about 300 different processes for the body. It has 300 different functions for the body, so it's an immensely important organ. Now, we also say that among those 300 different functions, they do a lot of different types of chemical reactions, and we call that those chemical reactions in combination together, we call that metabolic reactions or metabolism. So metabolic reactions or metabolism means the sum of all chemical reactions in the body or in a single cell. So the liver basically does a lot of this, one of which is the breakdown of lactic acid. But the thing is, in order for it to break down the lactic acid, it needs to have extra oxygen. So to think of it this way is that previously you're supposed to break the glucose down with oxygen for lots of energy. But you don't have enough oxygen because you're using it up too quickly, but you still want the energy. So the body cells are like, okay, you can break down the glucose. Not fully though, into lactic acid. But if you want to break that lactic acid further down, back into carbon dioxide and water, then you would need to repay the oxygen that you didn't use before. So it's almost like a debt, right? You have to pay what you are due. That's something that you're supposed to pay before, but you haven't, so you have to pay it now. So we say that the liver, in this case, you have to pay the oxygen debt. So the idea is the oxygen debt is the extra amount of oxygen needed to break the lactic acid down. But by doing so, you're able to completely remove the lactic acid, which means you no longer have muscle fatigue. The other thing that they also do is that they produce bile. This is something that you have learned previously in another chapter in the digestive one. So the bile is a particular chemical that is used in emulsification. So emulsification is where you are physically breaking a large oil drop down into smaller droplets, which increases the surface area to volume ratio massively to increase the speed of lipid digestion. So the liver releases the bile, which is stored in the gallbladder, and then it's released into the small intestine to help the digestion of fat. So that's one more function of the liver. Apart from that, it is also very important in detoxification. So as the name implies, detoxification means that the liver processes any toxic chemicals that we take into our body. Any sort of toxins would include things like medicine, drugs, alcohol, for example. So all of that is processed by the liver. So that's why we say that drinking too much alcohol would damage the liver, is because the alcohol can kill some of the liver cells as the liver is processing it, and too much of it means that the liver is being killed more quickly than it can regenerate itself. So liver is very important for detoxification. The fourth one is probably a bit harder to understand, which is the concept of deamination. So we should think about this in combination of the fifth one, which is that the liver also processes and breaks down old red blood cells or old proteins. So any red blood cells that have been working for a while, they would be essentially recycled. So, and the idea is that any proteins that are there, they're going to be broken down into amino acids, and those amino acids can be processed even further to regenerate new amino acids to make new proteins. And all of that is about making new red blood cells. And that includes the heme group or the hemoglobin inside the red blood cell as well. So it's all completely recycled to make new ones. Now, the reason why it says we should consider this in combination with deamination is that any old amino acids are processed through deamination. So deamination is it's breaking down and recycling those amino acids. Now, in order to know the detail of deamination, you will cover more of that if you do A-level biology. So we're not going to go into detail now, but deamination is one of the steps in processing and breaking down old amino acids and proteins. So these are the 4 to 5 key functions of the liver. So now let's just summarize the whole topic together. So respiration is a chemical reaction that releases energy by breaking glucose down, and it is an exothermic reaction. And that energy can be used for multiple different things like active transport, building molecules, maintaining body temperature, and for muscle contractions. And our body is actually able to respond to extra muscle contractions by changing the way that our heart and breathing works in order to supply more reactants for more aerobic respiration to occur. Focusing on aerobic respiration in this case, so it is a very essential function that any cell that is living should be doing aerobic respiration. It is the complete breakdown of glucose with oxygen to release lots and lots of energy. One thing that I should also mention is that aerobic respiration happens in the mitochondria, which is one of the key organelles in cells. So that's why muscle cells and sperm cells, they would contain more mitochondria than your regular cells because they need more energy to move around. And that is glucose plus oxygen reacting with oxygen to break down to make carbon dioxide and water. So in the case where there is not enough oxygen because you're using it up too much then compared to when you're breathing it, then we do anaerobic respiration instead. So in animals, the glucose is partially broken down into lactic acid, which can cause muscle fatigue, but then the liver can process that by breaking it down. In plants and in yeast, the glucose is broken down into ethanol and carbon dioxide, which is useful for us in baking and brewing. And in the case of the liver, apart from the fact that it breaks down the lactic acid by paying the oxygen debt, it can also have lots of different other functions, including in digestion, it can produce bile to speed up lipid digestion. It can do detoxification, breaking down and processing toxic chemicals, including alcohol and medicine. It can also do deamination, which in combination of breaking down old red blood cells to process old proteins and amino acids, recycling them to make new proteins and potentially new red blood cells as well. And that is a quick overview of respiration.